Hi guys and dolls. This one is going to be potentially a little bit rambly because there are a few different avenues that I want to go down with it, and I want to take my time. I don't want to rush it because some of the stuff that I'm going to be talking about could get quite convoluted and I don't want it to come out the wrong way. So I'm gonna pick my words carefully and kind of try and talk about a few things that I've been considering recently with regard to tradition in magical practices and tradition with regard to certain schools of belief that have become popular or that have kind of become well known or well understood within the community overall. So the first thing I was thinking about is the difference between the importance of knowing about different traditions and the importance of following a specific tradition. I can understand why people say that it's very important to have a strong background, like a strong academic knowledge of a few different traditions before you actually decide what your path is going to look like. And I think it's fairly obvious that if you've been following a specific path for a while, whether it's a strong tradition or whether it's something that you kind of put together yourself, we can assume that you've come to this decision about your path and what it looks like through a process of careful elimination. So we can assume that you haven't just kind of come across the first thing that you found or indeed designed your own practice without having an understanding of the practices that are already out there and the traditions that already exist. And through understanding those different traditions, you've gone through this process of elimination or this process of trying to validate for yourself what works for you. I think that it's probably very rare to come across a witch who follows a tradition without knowing anything about any other tradition. You need to kind of explore what's already there and sometimes may have to customise so that it feels right for you in a sense as well. And I've noticed that there are a lot of debates going on and have been going on for a long time in the online pagan community about this with regard to Wicca, about the difference between British traditional Wicca and solitary Wicca and the various differences between different kinds of solitary Wicca and stuff like that. So and you know, the long-standing debate about whether or not it's even valid to be a solitary Wiccan. So I think that that kind of debate is the more extreme end, where it becomes a difficult, controversial kind of subject, this discussion about whether or not solitary Wiccans can in fact take the term Wiccan for themselves. It's still kind of a discussion that goes on in forums and on blogs and stuff. So that's one kind of example, I would say, of a debate that centres around the idea of tradition and the idea of breaking with that tradition being bad or being not valid, being illegitimate somehow because it's not actually the tradition that was intended to be, kind of thing. I do think that it's important to have a knowledge of the different traditions and practices that are out there. I think it's a lot less important to expect yourself to follow one or to expect yourself to fall under the umbrella of one tradition or another. And I think it's really dangerous in paganism and probably in other areas of spiritual pathways as well that you could walk, but paganism obviously I'm discussing specifically because I am myself pagan. I think it's really dangerous to venerate a certain tradition or to decide that traditions in themselves which have any kind of long-lasting history are somehow more important or more valid or more legitimate than a tradition that somebody has kind of come to on their own, or a tradition that's quite new, or a pathway that is indeed kind of a mishmash of various different practices that they've come across and kind of made into their own thing. I think that there are discussions that go on about lineage with regard to tradition, about things being handed down from witch to witch to witch through the ages, and different ideas of old religions that exist and how they might necessarily be more important than new ideas and stuff. And I think that is the kind of thing that can get quite dangerous, because the most important thing in any kind of magical practice or ritual practice is that it speaks to the individual that's actually engaging in it. That for me is the most important thing, or as they say in chaos magic, you know, it has to work. That is the most important thing about a magical working, that you have to feel that it works, you have to be invested into it. So if you are given this belief that a certain tradition will work more for you because it is this tradition and there's so many texts surrounding it, or there's so many people that have learned from other people that learn from other people, then you might come to the idea that it does work for you purely on the basis that it should be powerful because it's a tradition, whereas inside your heart actually it leaves you feeling quite hollow or quite empty and doesn't really do a lot for you in terms of moving you closer towards spirit or making you feel spiritually empowered. I think if a tradition doesn't give you the empowerment that you need within the circle as a witch yourself, then it's not the tradition for you. It doesn't matter how old it is, it doesn't matter about the lineage, it doesn't matter about how much older it is than any other tradition, or how popular it's become, or who advocates it, or whatever. If it doesn't speak to you personally, then it's not the tradition for you. And I think that's kind of important to remember. And I also think that there are a lot of traditions out there that speak of the value of not doing magic for every little thing, or for only doing magic when it's completely necessary. There are a lot of ideas that coming from kind of like the magey side of it that say that you should only practice magic when all else has totally failed, which is kind of weird in a way if you think about it, because if the Meiji don't practice these incredible things that they've learned and studied and become invested in, then how do they actually know they're any good? How do they hone their skills? How do they actually become better? How do they become the best that they can be if their magical skills are always on the shelf, because, you know, they never use them unless the circumstance is really extreme? And this comes into another thing I was thinking about recently, about magical theory and magical books and all that kind of thing. Phil Hine, who's a really famous chaos magician, said that magic is exactly like sex. You could theorize and intellectualize about sex for years and years and years, and you could write books about it, and you could become very proficient at talking about it. But unless you've had sex, you don't know what you're talking about. It's all about the doing. So I think that a lot of these traditions are so bolstered because they are so well written about and they are so discussed as legitimate pathways. But unless you as an individual have some experience of how they work for you, then they don't work for you. And there is also a danger of people coming at certain traditions from a scholarly standpoint, where they're talking about, you know, how old this tradition is, how grand it is, how certain people have done this and this. But are those people the people actually doing it? Can they actually speak from experience? The only person that can speak from experience in your life is you. You can only know by trying and testing the methods and understanding what actually works for you. And I really believe that tradition can only be valuable for the individual if it actually does something for them personally and if they actually feel bonded with it. So on the one hand, I do think that having an academic knowledge of the various different traditions out there is really nourishing and important. And I think if you're a spiritual person and you're not inquisitive about the way other people are doing things or the way people were doing things in the past, then that's probably kind of strange. So, you know, there aren't going to be a lot of witches out there that don't have a decent working knowledge of various different systems. But I think the idea of it being important to follow a tradition is quite false and quite wrong. I think it can lead on to the dangerous ground of somebody following a tradition wholeheartedly and doggedly because it is a tradition, without actually having a sense that it works for them or that it does anything for them or that they actually kind of mesh with it. And I think that's what I was really talking about in the My Kind of Magic video. The idea that for ages I was like a round peg trying to fit myself into a square hole in a lot of ways. A lot of the resources that I was getting hold of and reading weren't doing anything for me on a personal level, and I think I was trying to forge practice very much into a tradition, one kind of tradition or another, and I was always wondering, you know, why doesn't this resonate with me? Why don't I feel anything when I'm doing this? You know, why don't I feel any connection to the idea of referring to the elements in the circle? Why don't I feel any connection to the idea of calling the corners? And I'm not just talking about Wicca, I'm talking about other traditions as well. I was always trying to kind of get hold of these resources so that I could try and make them into my practice. And I didn't know that I was allowed to look outside of the box. I didn't know that I was allowed to look as far outside of the box as I wanted to, until I came across stuff like, you know, the finer points of chaos magic and reading about chaos magic, and then the penny kind of dropped for me. And I suppose chaos magic in a sense is a tradition as well, but it's very new. It only came about in the 70s, and it is kind of a very Discordian idea of you know, we all need to stick apart kind of thing. We need to stick together, but it has to be apart. You know, we have to embrace what we need to embrace in the circle. We need to utilise the belief that we need in that moment, you know. So it's very much about individualised ritual, creative ritual, using what speaks to you, whether it's works of fiction, whether it's parapsychology, whether it's cosmology, whatever it is, quantum physics, you know, cut up magic. That's one thing that they talked about with regard to like beat literature, the idea of cutting up words and sentences and pasting them back together. All of these kinds of weird and wonderful ideas, not just sigil magic, but other things as well, like trinket animation, magic in the astral realm, creating astral altars. I mean, I'm not going to go into it all, but very creative ways of performing magic and testing the limits and actually trying to step outside of the boundary. And I think it's really important that people realise that they have the liberty to do that and that they should expect themselves to do that, because it's part of finding something that actually speaks to you and finding a way that you can tap into your power so that it's productive and so that it actually does something. And I think if you're constantly bombarded with ideas that tradition is paramount and tradition is more important than forging your own pathway or creating your own idea, then you might end up stuck with a tradition that you don't feel anything for, and I think that's dangerous. And I think, there are in the YouTube community, I must admit that I've seen very little evidence of people trying to push anybody towards a specific tradition. There's a lot of openness, and there are a lot of eclectic solitary witches out there doing very much their own thing and appreciating like so many different kinds of path and trying to take a little bit of something, a little bit of something else, kind of like graciously creating a recipe for their own pathway. And I think that's really good. But I have noticed, in forums and on blogs and maybe a video or two, I don't know, but through the years I've noticed that tradition is sometimes venerated in a dangerous way, in a way that kind of takes from somebody's individuality and their right to learn what kind of witch they are on their own terms. And the fear that some people may have of witches breaking with tradition comes from probably a few different places. Firstly, if a tradition has really worked for you and you feel that it is something that you completely revere and you will be a part of for the rest of your life, then I suppose it's natural in a way to want to steer other witches, maybe more, maybe younger witches, people that are younger on the path. It's natural to want to steer them towards a tradition that you feel to be wholesome and good and nourishing. You don't want to see them going towards the wild west of witchcraft. You want to see them kind of studying a practice that has done so much for you and means so much to you. So it kind of comes from a caring place, but I think also sometimes it can come from a dangerous feeling of elitism, I guess. I think if you're part of a long-standing tradition of any kind and you feel that that tradition is kind of to be respected and honoured and means more than the sum of its parts, if that makes sense. I think that there's an elitism there, and I think that this fear of people kind of breaking the rules or not even thinking that those rules matter, thinking that they can just go off and do what the hell they like. I think there's a danger with that, because rules are quite comforting. They create a structure, they have a value to them. We understand what happens when we fall on the wrong side of them. They can make ritual and practice feel richer and more organised. They can give a depth to things, and I think when you see somebody just going off and tearing up the rule book, it can probably make somebody with a strong traditional background feel kind of quite unbalanced or on edge and kind of think, well, why would you do that? What's the reasoning behind it, kind of thing. And also I think there's also a perception that those who throw away the rulebook and very much create their own pathway and do not follow any tradition are kind of playing God in a sense, because following a tradition is in a manner subservient. I'm not saying it's like, got anything to do with slavery, but it's a commitment. It's a real commitment. It's something that people take very seriously. There are, as I said, a lot of rules, a lot of structure. There's a lot of discipline innately in any kind of magical tradition. So when you see somebody that's actually saying, I'm kind of anti-tradition and that's what works for me, I think there can be a sense of somebody getting too big for their magical boots almost and not respecting the way things are done. So I suppose that's part of it as well. But the way that you'll know that a tradition isn't working for you is purely on the basis of intuition. If you can hear your inner voice, if you are in the circle and you're performing this rite from this tradition that's very respected and you've read a lot of texts about it, if your inner voice shines through and says, I kind of feel like this is hollow, or I feel like this isn't working, or I'm not really sure that I'm connecting to it, then that's all you'll need, and then you will know that you need to kind of play with the variables and move things around. I think for me, the sense of breaking with tradition came as I got older, and I realised that even after a very long time of identifying as a witch on and off through my life, I still had not found a tradition that I could definitely pin myself to, and I never have pinned myself to a tradition before. I've always just been an eclectic witch, but I suppose something about, especially since I'm a very ritual practitioner, I'm all about ritual. I think something about embracing a solid practice with a lot of text behind it and a lot of history behind it spoke to me, and I wondered why I still wasn't coming to the stage where I felt that any book was really nailing something on the head for me. I wondered why I'd never cracked a book that made me go, my God, this is exactly how I feel. And I kind of started listening to my inner voice while I was reading certain books, particularly from witches who are part of different traditions or part of covens or part of something a lot more structured than I was ever prepared to go for in my own practice. And I suppose just certain things I read didn't sit well with me. Like, for example, this idea of light and dark magic didn't sit very well with me. I just felt that things were more complicated than that and a lot less monochrome than that, and I didn't really want to surrender myself to any kind of system that believed certain magical workings to be somehow innately bad or innately good. It just seemed too moralistically simple for me. And I don't really think of magic in terms of that Christian idea or that Abrahamic idea of good and bad. I suppose I feel that one of the reasons that I'm drawn to magic and witchcraft is because I'm a pantheist, so I don't really look at things in that black and white moral tone. I am somewhat of a moral existentialist, and I also believe that belief is fluid. It's not absolute much of the time. It depends on circumstance and time frame. And I do think that a lot of people, I think it's very easy for, say for example, if you were in an argument with somebody, I think it's very easy for you to turn around and say, I reacted like this during the argument with that person because this is how I felt at the time, whereas the other person reacted like that because that's who they are, that's their personality. It's very easy to give yourself a lot of credit and a lot of forgiveness for your behaviour because you see that your behaviour is fluid. Sometimes you behave one way because the circumstance is such, and another time you behave another way because the circumstance has changed, or you reacted in the way that was suitable for that circumstance. Whereas when you're looking at another person, it's easy to whitewash. It's easy to be like, well, she did that because she's an irritating fuck, or whatever. She did that because her personality is insecure and jealous, or whatever. Whereas I was just reacting to my environment at that time. And I think, you know, it's very easy to look at light and dark magic or black and white magic, whatever you want to call it, in terms of what other people are doing and othering those people and being like they're not on the right moralistic pathway, and then seeing yourself as just kind of like the product of your environment. You behaved a certain way because you were in that situation. So I think it's kind of very easy to look at somebody else and judge what they're doing without having an understanding of where they're coming from, and yet when it comes to yourself, being much more kind of able to open your mind up and be expansive and see why you may have done something that, you know, might have kind of stretched the moral line a little bit, or been not quite what you would do usually, but you felt like it was necessary at that time, kind of thing. So yeah, I think the idea of black magic is very unforgiving, and I also think that it doesn't embrace the whole animal. And as a pantheist, I feel that nature is everything that it can be. You know, it is so ecstatic, but it is so unbelievably brutal at the same time. So black and white magic just didn't seem right. It was too simplistic. So that was one thing that I read in several books that I kind of thought, this really doesn't gel with me. It's not something that I can just convince myself to be part of, you know, like I could with reading about circle work and ritual. I would be like, okay, so I've got to include the 4 elements, and I've got to include this, and you know, I've got to close the circle afterwards and do something with the energy and such. These were things that I could attempt to put into practice, and I could explore, and I could kind of, I'm very malleable, I think, and I think that's part of why my spirituality feels so rich to me, is because I am flexible. I do yield to the things that I read. My belief is not absolute. I can change things up. I like to experiment. I like to see what works for me, and I like to have those experiences firsthand. But with things like the black and white magic idea, I just couldn't buy that. It wasn't something that I could even remotely get on board with, and that's how I knew that these certain ideas were ideas that I could not embrace, not even in part. And other things as well, like I was reading a book the other day, and there was a question in it from a young witch saying, you know, this coven want me to get involved with them at university, but I understand that drug taking is part of their practice. What should I do? And this witch, who by all accounts is a high priestess, a very respected witch, responded with, you know, you shouldn't mess around with these people that are just destroying themselves, and you know, they think it's all about the party. They're obviously not being genuine. They're obviously not going into the circle with a pure heart. Do not get involved with these people. And I thought to myself, well, surely you understand that shamans since time immemorial have been using entheogens to, open up the doorways into other realms and to explore parts of their consciousness that are normally hidden from view. Or, I don't know, I just think it's just so black and white, I think. And I understand that the concept of drug use in spirituality is quite controversial in some circles, but for me it's never been a point of controversy. It's up to you what you consider to be sacramental or not in your circle, and I think it's very dangerous to tar absolutely everybody with this hedonistic drug taking party whore brush, when in reality there could be way deeper reasons for their exploration of certain substances. And I don't think it's right to talk about a coven in those terms without potentially asking them why they do what they do and how they feel about it personally. I think it's just very, very, I don't know, it's like policing somebody's spirituality. I think the best advice to give would have been, if it doesn't feel right for you, if it doesn't feel, if your intuition is tingling, your spidey sense is tingling, don't go there. Never do anything like that with fear in your heart. If it's something that you feel that you're open to, then that is your journey, but you shouldn't let those people manipulate you into anything that you don't want to do, rather than just immediately saying, you're a white witch, they're black witches, get rid of them, they're not doing it right. It's like, well, they're not doing it right according to who? Some of the most ancient traditions in the world are based around entheogens and psychedelic spirituality. So I just found it to be kind of presumptuous and alienating for me. So these are just ideas of things that I've read that I really can't. It's like I said about that round peg square hole thing. I can't do it. There are certain places into which I just don't fit, and I have to get out. I think also another way that you'll know is, as I said, when the ritual just feels dead, or when you're trying to embrace this tradition but it just feels dead, there's nothing alive in it, you feel like you're going through the motions in a sense, and it doesn't matter how venerated a tradition is, if it makes your time in the circle feel pointless or hollow, or as though it's devoid of any kind of spiritual openness or understanding of who you are and how your power can affect everything around you, then what does it matter about lineage? What does it matter about time that's passed? What does it matter about who advocates it and how great these people are or whatever? If it's not working for you, find something that does work for you. And finally, I don't know, I might just read the principles of chaos magic out for you guys, just kind of thinking about how chaos magic itself has become in part a tradition, but it's a tradition that kind of rejects tradition at the same time. I guess the core principles of chaos magic, according to Phil Hine, are kind of a good way for people to understand how I myself do see magic in terms of how it can be helpful and how it can be best posited into my own life. But there are certain things that I would also add to this, but I may talk a bit more about my core principles in another video. But yeah, these are just a few ideas that I resonated with after a long time of reading books and tapping into resources that I did not resonate with, and I was just trying to convince myself that I resonated with them, but really I didn't. And this is just a small list of core principles that I really felt like I did resonate with. So the first one is the avoidance of dogmatism. Like I was saying about the Discordians, saying like us Discordians need to stick apart, there's a very similar thing with chaos magic, whereby there's an idea that chaos magicians, chaos witches stick together by sticking apart. It's very much about building your own tradition, and it's also about not trying to be right all the time. I really feel like I don't know, like a friend told me a while ago that there was an anti-fundamentalism protest in Washington where she lives, and she said it was so funny. She said it was basically a bunch of people walking around with banners and placards saying things like, maybe you're wrong, maybe I'm wrong, let's just go get a beer. This idea that nobody really needs to be right, existence in a way almost exists so that we can just consciously observe it and talk about it and bat the ball of it back and forth. I mean, who's ever going to know the answer at the end of the day? There are so many different ones that people subscribe to. All we can really do is learn from each other in a non-dogmatic fashion, and in the end shake hands, be civil with each other, and decide that, you're walking your path, I'm walking my path, and maybe our paths will cross at some point and we'll sit down and have a picnic. So, that desire to avoid dogmatism is very important to me in my practice. Two, personal experience is paramount. This is like what I was saying about how magic is a lot like sex. You know, you could write a really thick book on it, but if you haven't actually done it yourself, then how much do you really know about it? If you haven't experienced magic working for you, if you haven't experienced the way it can change your life, or experienced your own sense of your personal power, then you do not have the right to give it all up to a certain tradition or to name yourself a certain thing, because if it doesn't work for you, it's not working. You know, the whole point of being a witch is to own your personal power, and if there's a rather strangled route towards finding your personal power, then walk that strangled route. You know, don't stop at the first thing that seems like home. If it's not warm and it's not feeding you, if it's not nourishing you, if you don't feel safe there, it's not home, it's just a big fancy house. That's kind of how I see it. Number three, technical excellence. There is an idea with chaos magic and with other different like traditions and ideas that involve very much doing it your own way, that you can be sloppy in your work, that you don't have to dedicate yourself to it, that it can be flippant or fickle or callous or superficial. And that's not the idea with any kind of magic or ritual that I practice. I definitely believe in recording my results. I believe in looking at the different aspects of things that I can change. I believe in doing it right. I believe if I'm planning a ritual, I should plan it to perfection. You know, just because I'm about creativity rather than tradition, I still don't think that I don't think that allows me to be sloppy or to be kind of like fickle about it or whatever. I still think that I'm a serious practitioner, but I also like to have a lot of fun with it. And, you know, I think that comedy has its place in the circle too. Four, deconditioning. This is just the idea of not holding on too closely to any one belief system, but understanding that in fact many different belief systems can serve you differently at different times. And I think that's something important to remember. Again, this is something that is not relevant to everybody. It's certainly not relevant to anyone who is part of a strict, stringent tradition, which, you know, deals with their own core beliefs and have, you know, their own core principles. But for me personally, almost the lack of core belief is what's important and what will serve me. So I might get into that more in another video, but if you just kind of look up chaos magic paradigm shifts or belief as a tool, that will kind of explain more about why that's a principle for me in magic. Number five, diverse approaches. It says here, traditional approaches to magic involve choosing one particular system and sticking to it. The chaos perspective, if nothing else, encourages an eclectic approach to development, and chaos magicians are free to choose from any available magical systems. So that's like themes from literature, television, you know, anything like that, looking at figures from history, exploring the future. So it is about just basically being diverse, trying different things, trying things that speak to you. If something doesn't speak to you, throw it out and replace it with something that does, because it's about personal power being put into a personal wish for manifestation. It's not about whitewashing something with this is how you do this and you put these ingredients together and then this happens. According to who? Does it happen for you as an individual? That's what it's important to really know. Does it happen for you? Does it resonate with you? Does it make you feel something deep down? If it doesn't, then it's just something in a book. It may work for others, but the most important thing is individual responsibility for personal power. And six is gnosis. Gnosis is basically the magical ability to instantly attain another level of consciousness. This can be done in two ways. Well, I mean, in chaos magic, they talk about inhibitory states and excitatory states. Basically, inhibitory would be meditating, doing yoga, lucid dreaming to an extent, contemplation, sensory deprivation, whereas excitatory states would be reached by chanting, drumming, like dance, emotional and sexual arousal, the use of entheogenic substances, etc. So yeah, gnosis again is something that's actually, I suppose in a way it could be translated into a few different traditions, but it's something that is very specific, at least under that name, to chaos magic. But yeah, I just thought I'd read that because it was really the first and the only set of magical principles that resonated with me on some level, and I think it's just really important to find what resonates with you. You know, don't be too overwhelmed by the idea that tradition is key, because if tradition leaves you feeling hollow, then is it your key? Is it the key to your particular door? No matter how many other people have walked through it successfully with that key, is it the key for you? You know, if not, you may need to begin looking for another one. So just thoughts. Blessed be.